Today I thought I'd take a look at the UKIP Interim Manifesto that was published in September. As an interim manifesto, it will of course be replaced by a newer manifesto when the general election comes. But I think it's instructive as to the recent direction of the party. The manifesto is laid out as a series of policy points, 13 total, so this is going to be a somewhat lengthy video, but I'm not going to spend inordinate amounts of time on each section either. Instead, I'll give a drive-by overview. Things start quite naturally with Brexit, their flagship issue, the issue that defines them as a party, the issue they were formed to fight for. As someone who voted Leave and a believer that we should avoid Brexit in name only, obviously I'm with them here. It's just a pity the Conservative Party is in charge of the leaving process. UKIP wants to branch out and become a quote-end-quote proper party, but if we end up with Brexit in name only thanks to Mommy May, expect more campaigning to rectify that. Next up is the NHS. Now, it seems I'm a bit more market radical on the NHS than UKIP are, but it's not really a central issue to me. I would prefer the NHS to be reformed into something closer to a national survival service, in which life-threatening conditions come under the rubric of free at the point of use, but some level of charges are issued for other things so as to ensure long-term solvency. But like I said, it's not central to me, and it's important for a credible party to have a preservationist position on the NHS. The proposals here involve ending health tourism and preventing excessive litigation, which sounds perfectly reasonable. Sections 3 and 4 are on social care and the welfare state, and here UKIP position themselves to the left of the Tory party, at least in policy terms. I'm a supporter of the welfare state in one form or another, and have advocated for gradually introducing a basic income guarantee in the future as automation increases. Of course, a welfare state has to actually be solvent, so ultimately UKIP is really in a middle ground position, really. They want to make sure that those who can work are working, but that the methods of assessment currently used are reformed, and that the rights of NEETs and autistic disabled people, are protected. So the farmed out ATOS model will be scrapped and replaced with assessment by actual medical practitioners. Additionally, they would scrap the so-called bedroom tax by retaining the spare room subsidy. I'm all for this kind of position on the social safety net, so long as it's balanced out by good market fundamentals. Section 5 is immigration. Here I pretty much outflank UKIP again in radicalism. With the way I view culpability, I'm okay with a border that pretty much includes a killing zone, so long as everything is above board. Not going to pass water with the mainstream though, so an Australian-style point system sounds like a good start. I would like to see specific visa restrictions that would exclude a whole swathe of Middle Eastern and African countries that are either unstable, poorly developed, and/or majority Islamic. We can't just close the borders, unfortunately, but in that light we should prioritise skilled immigration rather than low-skilled labour. The eastern half of Asia should be prioritised for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with yellow fever whatsoever. Next, they lay down their position on housing. They say that the UK does not have a housing problem, it has a demand problem, pointing again to uncontrolled immigration. I would disagree slightly only in that we have a demand and a supply problem, because even minus immigration, the country is too overpopulated versus the amount of land that is available for building. I think that for too long we've prioritised housing as a store of wealth and a commodity. Housing costs are a huge problem, and are responsible for most of the issues the left brings up on the economic front. Of course, they want more subsidised housing without doing anything to solve the cost issue, and the real fundamental solution is to deregulate zoning and to actually allow more house building on green land. So the Libertarians have the correct solution for this issue. Of course, some people don't want this because it would lower their property values, and the banks wouldn't want it because they take advantage of mortgage-backed securities, which keep blowing up, and then we have to bail the suckers out as they keep merging and merging together into one big ball of financial contagion. But we've got to change the state of affairs even if we can't just go in swinging with a baseball bat. With my position on the issue out in the open, I can say that I have not been too happy with UKIP's position on this issue elsewhere. I saw a video on their website which was all about preventing building on jolly old English green fields. I grant you that stuffing more people in and using up more land is a pain, but these people exist and they're not going to stop existing, and they need housing that is affordable, and the only way to do that is to increase supply one way or another. Certainly, yes, we can ease things by reducing the population pressures caused by uncontrolled immigration, but that's only the start in my view. That being said, here in their interim manifesto, UKIP lays out a set of policy ideas that aren't so bad. They'd prevent foreign investors from buying up housing, prevent social housing going to immigrants, and they plan to build 1 million new houses on brownfield sites. as well as identifying central and local government-owned land that can be privately appropriated. All well and good. Again, I guess my main issue is that we should go a bit further, and we should be building on the green belt and so on. But so long as they aren't prioritising property values too much, we'll see. None of the main parties seem able to deviate from the cycle of housing bubbles. Moving on to education, among a range of policies that interest me is their stance on waiving tuition fees on STEM subjects. Perfectly solid. What I'd like is for them to call for reduced subsidisation for non-STEM subjects, but maybe that's too radical for a party that wants to break into the mainstream. They do oppose what they call gender confusion ideologies, but I would like to see a bold proposal to defund public university and private subsidised courses on gender studies and similar fields. It's like they're dancing around the edge of the main issue here, at least based on this section. Otherwise it's fine. Dropping the target of 50% of people going to higher education is good. Degree inflation is a problem that devalues the whole process, and a lot of people will be better off going into trades. Fair enough. Then there's transport. Not too much for me to say about that. They want to scrap HS2 and they show that they are interested in technological advancement with their support for driverless cars and increasing the electric car infrastructure. The devil is in the details of all this minutiae stuff. On to number 9, foreign aid. For my part, there shouldn't be any government foreign aid at all. It should be entirely 100% privatised. That they want to reduce it at all is good enough for me, considering the other parties. Number 10 is defence and security. They want to keep Britain out of wars that are not in their interests, and they specifically admonish Labour and the Conservatives for their role in getting Britain muddled up in the Middle East, playing topple the dictator and free the Islamists. So top marks there. There's no contradiction in the fact that they want Britain to have a decently strong military, and for a nuclear arsenal to be maintained. Again, a big fat agree. 11 is veterans issues, and I agree with all of that. So that's that really. 12 is police and criminal justice, and I do have some things to say here. This is where they really start delivering on the issues that are critical today in the internet politics sphere. So they want the police to regain funding, pointing out that it's actually half the overseas budget at the moment, which by the way would mean cutting overseas aid entirely would allow you to double the police budget in a revenue neutral way. They would repeal EU legislation and roll back direct entry of officers, but the important part to us is that they would require the police to investigate real crimes rather than hate speech legislation, and they specifically mention the Met's 900-odd web officers. They also want to crack down on female genital mutilation. All very good steps indeed. Now, I would like it if they outright said they wanted to repeal hate speech and hate crime legislation entirely here, but since Labour, the Cons, the Lib Dems and the Greens are all going in the other direction on this issue, that there is a party going in the opposite direction at all is a good enough start, I think. Their positions on prison, agriculture and the fisheries are all largely agreeable without comment. So moving on to point 16, economy and trade, they rightly point out that only a portion of the UK economy is concerned with exporting to the EU, but all businesses must have EU-tailored regulations, which is a very important point because in the event of Brexit we can reduce a lot of these regulations. You know, assuming we have an actual Brexit and not what Theresa May is giving us. The balanced approach comes up again, in that they want to see a generally freer market but are sensitive to people getting impoverished at the margins and being defrauded. So they want to minimise zero-hour contracts. I'm not sure about their industrial policy. They want to increase Britain's manufacturing capacity, but I'm not sure that's something that can be done so artificially. Certainly with increases in automation, businesses can return overseas from cheap labour zones to the UK, but I'm not sure about this grant scheme. Maybe. It depends on exactly how it's implemented. On point 18, energy, I really have to start disagreeing. They seem overly focused on returning to the past with regard to coal, and they're a bit lackadaisical about global warming. I'm not against scrapping the 2008 Climate Change Act. An annual decarbonisation of 5% may be a bit much when you consider that on net over decades. I think artificially trying to reduce emissions without any kind of replacement would be bad. This is why I've always seen the solution as lying on the positive side of subsidising green energy, rather than the negative side of penalising greenhouse energy. I don't think subsidies for wind and solar should be ended, and I certainly don't think coal should be renewed. The desire to bring back the mines is very Corbyn-esque, and frankly will only help the Labour Party. Thatcher was right to close the nationalised coal mines, which had been declining in employment for the entire century up to that point. Frankly, it's a good thing to have less people labouring under such conditions. Point 19 is the environment, and they outright oppose what they call the dogma of anthropogenic climate change here. You're just plain wrong on that. Previously, deniers argued that it wasn't happening, and now they've switched to essentially arguing that greenhouse gases aren't responsible for the warming. I feel that just as UKIP is changing in the right ways to support issues youth care about such as free speech, they should follow the science on global warming. The influence of some significant figures like Christopher Monckton remains over the party, even long after he was removed by Nigel Farage. If you need convincing of the arguments, I would suggest looking into the videos of YouTuber Potholer45, who did an entire video series debunking denier claims. Here I'll only reiterate that it's happening. I don't actually agree with a certain segment on the left that totally drastic action needs to be taken, totally upheaving our living standards, but I do think that we should encourage the technology that will reduce the impact. Otherwise, I'm glad they recognise the value of the environment per se. They have 3 points here, one on allowing farmers to undertake drainage work to prevent flooding without being penalised, which I agree with. Another on protecting the green belt, which I kind of don't agree with, because I think the people are more important than nice views. And finally, they want to address excessive packaging, remove the 5p bag charge, and legislate to bring about biodegradable plastic bags. Plastic pollution is actually a huge issue, but it's the price you pay for a huge global population, which is why I welcome low birth rates and population decline in the long term. In the meantime, it's all about trade-offs. How much more will it cost us to make everything biodegradable versus the tangible benefits we gain from it in terms of increasing our chances of survival? That's entirely about implementation and the on-the-ground facts, and not ideological principles. So it really does depend, and I don't find the actual stated policy here to be objectionable. I only wish they would accept that global warming is caused by emissions. 1 or 2 metre sea rise by the end of the century might not be the end of the world, but it's something we can mitigate in a relatively organic way, if only we don't deliberately fight against clean energy innovations. On that note, I sincerely hope that UKIP will support funding for nuclear fusion research, but there doesn't seem to be anything about that here. I'm pretty much mostly with them on small business, though I think the market itself is more important than any individual businesses. Every small business dreams of being a giant, after all. I like that they would punish big business and public-owned bodies for failing to honour their payments to smaller companies and contractors. I'm well down with that. I'd like to see reductions in the amount of licensing that creates barriers to entry, but what they have here is fine. Then it's on to taxation, everyone's favourite topic. Raise personal tax threshold, help those on low incomes. Good. UKIP will change the BBC licensing fee from a tax to a voluntary subscription. Fucking awesome! I'm not quite clear whether they want to retain government ownership of the BBC, but it sounds like they'd privatise it, which is fucking mint. They want to retain the BBC World Service under government ownership though. Nah, go full hog or go home. Privatise the entire lot of it. I don't think the government should own any media whatsoever. The idea is that the government is equipped to operate it without bias, but this has been shown to be entirely false. It creates a moral hazard in relation to democracy too, in that the government media can be biased to one party or another in this subtle way or that subtle way, and buy up one side that will be willing to do them favours. I think it's entirely wrong. It's corruption in of itself. Its existence is corrupt. I go full libertarian when it comes to government-owned media. Privatise it now. UKIP also wants to abolish inheritance tax. I don't think we get a lot from that tax revenue-wise, so it wouldn't be a problem, but I don't really have the moral problem with it everyone else has, and in theory it's one of the least distortionary taxes there is. Income taxes distort labour and consumption taxes distort consumption in very direct and immediate ways. Generally, people still work to benefit themselves and their families while they are alive, and there are ways of giving your kids a leg up without just leaving them a lump sum when you die. If you reduced other taxes, then people might have more money while they're alive and kicking anyway. This is where I get more pragmatic and less libertarian. Or at least if we have concerns about taking people's wealth, then we should prioritise the least market-distorting taxes. The inheritance tax may be one of those. Another interesting one to prioritise is the land value tax. I'm very interested in the Georgist position on this, even if I don't take it quite so far as the 19th century single taxes. Abolishing stamp duty is good though. Certain kinds of taxation should probably be abolished altogether, and it's a good thing to try and wean out regressive forms of taxation, though we have to consider that certain forms of progressive taxation might have to be increased in compensation for pragmatic revenue-related reasons. I mean, the UK does have a fair bit of public debt to finance. On that note, they want to crack down on the avoidance of tax by large entities like multinational corporations, which sounds good to me. It's just common sense to do so. Now, on families, UKIP wants to make sure that parents have more rights, which is a good thing. Keeping families together is vital if you care about poverty. It's the best way to support children. They also want to do something about the grooming gang problem, and they address the relation of Islam to the problem, which is a dicey issue to be sure, but one that needs to be faced head-on without any flinching. It's all about impartial and equal application of the law. An inquiry into the police force would be great. I can imagine it being heavily resisted by some corrupt elements, but it needs to be done in order for justice to be carried out. We come straight back to the Islamic question after a brief detour on animal rights. And here are UKIP's Islamic-specific policies. They would ban the overseas funding of UK mosques. Now, I'd be very much against banning the construction of mosques per se, because that would be a step onto a dangerously slippery slope in regard to citizens' rights. But if you were talking about non-citizens funding things in the UK, then the government can cut off those cash flows without the danger of stepping onto a slippery slope. Non-citizens have no rights here, and countries like Saudi Arabia are responsible for the funding of the dangerous Deobandi sect of the Muslim faith in the UK. UKIP also finally come out and say that they want visa restrictions for Islamic countries, which is good. But the tricky part is they want to restrict immigration from these countries to people who do not follow an extremist version of Islam. Of course, the problem with that is that it would be easy enough to just lie your way through this sort of test. In my book, I don't see why we need immigration from the Middle East at all. Any high-class labour like engineers and scientists we can get from elsewhere. We don't need the Middle East, and it's a privilege for anyone from any country to be able to come here. I would say that visa regimes should be wholesale restrictive for many of these countries to the point of allowing zero legal immigration. Why take the risk just for the hell of it? UKIP also want to separate Islamic preachers in prison and repeal protections for Sharia courts. All good. The law of the land should be the law of the land. I want to make sure, however, that equality before the law is maintained, and that the legal system does not penalise non-criminal Muslim citizens merely for being Muslim. As well as being unjust, that would be a threat to all our rights. So while I might be just a little further to the right on this issue than UKIP, I would not support many of the illiberal responses to the problem that we see over on the continent, such as proposed bans on items of clothing and so on. That's a threat to my rights too. We need to tackle these problems in a very specific way, and UKIP seem to have more or less the right approach. Constitutional and political reform is pretty much all about how first past the post fails us and how parties can get huge numbers of votes which are then translated into hardly any seats. This is the reason that third parties are helpless in this country, except as weak pawns in coalitions. It needs a dedicated video of its own, to be honest. Under the current first past the post system, there is little point voting for a third party because it just helps either Labour or the Conservatives, depending on which party you pick, will siphon whose votes the most. It's a pity we lost the alternative vote referendum. We have to try again. Next is English governance issues in relation to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. I'm not so fussed about this stuff. I'd rather more local stuff is addressed more locally for all parties involved, and that's my only real principle on this. I said earlier that I wished that UKIP would come straight out and repeal hate speech laws, and in this section on free speech they more or less say that they would, which is exactly what I want to hear. I do wish they wouldn't use the term cultural Marxism though. It's really cringy and ultimately muddles and obscures more than it explains anything in a truly accurate way. They also want to repeal the so-called Equality Act of 2010. So goodbye to special privileges. Good riddance. They would shut down the Equalities and Human Rights Commission and the Government Equalities Office, which is another excellent suggestion. Basically all we need is equality before the law, and any office that has equality in the name is probably focused on equality of outcome like the rest, and should be completely removed from the government. It has no place in our society. The penultimate item on the agenda is cost savings. They emphasise the savings of leaving the EU, of course, but they have some policies in mind too. It seems like they might be interested in abolishing the overseas aid budget entirely, at least going off this section, even if it seemed more ambiguous earlier. They want to slash the quangos for big savings, but that's also good in itself, because quangos are dog shit. Abolishing HS2 would save 100 billion. There's some good ideas here, but we'll see the fully costed version when they come out with a general election manifesto, which I'll likely be covering in a podcast with a friend of mine. The final point, number 30, only says that the constituent country branches of UKIP will produce their own manifestos at the appropriate time. Okay, fair enough. Now to conclude and sum up my thoughts on this interim manifesto. Obviously it's not the final word on UKIP that will stand for all time, but it gives us a good idea of the direction the party is going in, and I think that's a promising direction overall. I do disagree on their stance on global warming and coal, but that's probably my only major disagreement. On most other things they're going in the right direction. We just disagree on the magnitude of the changes required. Overall, I recommend this party, at least in theory, if it were viable in the British system to vote for them, but you know how that is.